I want Naomi. The scream cut through the ballroom so sharply that even the string quartet missed a note. Crystal glasses froze halfway to polished lips. Conversations collapsed into whispers beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. 8-year-old Ethan Sinclair stood beside the shattered remains of a 5-tier birthday cake worth more than most people's monthly rent, his small chest rising and falling in ragged breaths as vanilla frosting clung to the sleeves of his navy blazer. The little silver crown that had been carefully placed on his head now lay upside down near the marble fireplace. Across the room, New York's wealthiest families stared in stunned silence while waiters hurried to stop rivers of icing from dripping onto imported Italian rugs. Victoria Sinclair's jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. "Ethan," she said carefully, forcing a smile through embarrassment, "that is enough." But Ethan shook his head violently, tears streaking down his flushed cheeks. "I don't want them," he cried. "I want Naomi." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward the back corner of the room where Naomi Carter stood beside the catering entrance holding a folded linen napkin against her chest. She hadn't moved since the yelling started. Her dark green nanny uniform suddenly felt too tight beneath the weight of dozens of judging stares. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others didn't bother hiding their expressions at all. Naomi recognized those looks. She'd seen them her whole life. The kind that reduced a person before they even spoke. The kind that said servant before human. Victoria let out a brittle laugh that carried no warmth whatsoever. "She's just the nanny," she said quietly, though not quietly enough. The sentence drifted through the ballroom like cold smoke. Naomi lowered her eyes instinctively. She knew the rules in houses like this. Stay invisible. Stay useful. Never become emotionally important. But before she could step backward toward the hallway, Ethan shouted again, louder this time. "No." His voice cracked under the pressure of tears he could no longer hold back. "She's the only one who loves me." Silence. Complete and immediate. Somewhere near the piano, a champagne flute slipped from someone's fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Naomi felt her stomach tighten painfully. Across the room, Alexander Sinclair slowly lowered the glass of bourbon he'd been holding all evening. Unlike his wife, he didn't look angry. He looked caught off guard. Almost frightened. Ethan's breathing became uneven again, small panicked gasps pulling at his chest while the room watched like strangers observing an animal in distress. Naomi recognized the signs immediately. The trembling hands. The widening eyes. The desperate search for safety. She moved before thinking. "Ethan," she said softly, kneeling a few feet away from him. Her voice barely rose above the hum of the ballroom air conditioning, but the boy heard it instantly. "Hey, sweetheart. Look at me." Victoria's expression hardened. "Naomi, don't interfere." But Ethan already had his eyes locked on Naomi's face. The panic in him softened by inches. Naomi kept her tone calm and steady, the same way she used to speak to her daughter years ago during thunderstorms back in Atlanta when the power would flicker and the little apartment walls would shake with rain. "Breathe with me," she whispered. "Just nice and slow." Ethan copied her unevenly at first. Inhale. Exhale. His tiny shoulders loosened little by little while Naomi stayed perfectly still, giving him room instead of pressure. Around them, wealthy guests shifted awkwardly in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, suddenly unsure where to look. Because for the first time all night, the most expensive room in Manhattan no longer belonged to them. It belonged to a crying child and the black nanny they had spent the entire evening pretending not to see. The ballroom never fully recovered after Ethan's outburst. Even 20 minutes later, conversations remained thin and cautious beneath the soft jazz drifting from the stage. Guests smiled too hard. Laughed too softly. The Sinclair estate overlooking the Hudson still glittered with impossible wealth, but the warmth had drained out of the room the moment a little boy chose the nanny over his own family. Naomi stood quietly near the kitchen hallway while Catering staff cleared ruined plates and replaced table settings that cost more than the rent on her apartment in Queens. She kept her hands folded neatly in front of her, trying to disappear again. It was a habit she had learned years ago. Invisible people survived longer in places like this. You should have stopped him sooner. The voice came low and sharp beside her. Naomi turned carefully to find Victoria Sinclair standing there in a silver evening gown that shimmered beneath the chandelier light like ice on dark water. Up close, the woman smelled faintly of expensive perfume and white wine. Her smile never reached her eyes. Naomi lowered her gaze respectfully. I tried, ma'am. Victoria crossed her arms. Children get attached to employees. It happens. But boundaries matter in this house. Naomi nodded once. Yes, ma'am. You are here to assist, Victoria continued. Not become emotionally involved. Each word landed softly but carried the weight of a warning. Naomi felt heat rise beneath her collar, though her face remained calm. She had heard versions of this speech before. Different houses. Different cities. Same message. Know your place. Before Naomi could answer, small footsteps rushed across the marble floor. Ethan appeared beside her and grabbed her hand tightly with both of his. His cheeks were still pink from crying, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. There you are, he whispered breathlessly, as if he had been afraid she disappeared. Victoria's expression tightened again. Ethan, your guests are waiting. I do not care. The honesty in his voice startled even him. Naomi gently squeezed his hand. Hey, she said softly. That is not polite. Ethan looked up at her immediately, the storm inside him calming by instinct alone. Victoria noticed it too. Naomi could tell by the flicker in the woman's eyes. Not jealousy exactly. Something more complicated. Something unsettled. Across the ballroom, Alexander Sinclair watched the interaction in silence from beside the fireplace. Tall, composed, impossible to read. Unlike his wife, he rarely interrupted. He simply observed everything with the distant stillness of a man used to controlling rooms. Without raising his voice, Ethan tugged lightly on Naomi's sleeve. Can we go upstairs? He asked quietly. It is too loud down here. Naomi crouched slightly so she could meet his eyes. Did you finish greeting your grandparents? Ethan hesitated. No, then we do that first. He sighed dramatically, shoulders slumping beneath his tiny blazer. Okay. Naomi smiled despite herself. 1 table. 5 minutes. Ethan held up 3 fingers instead. 3. 4. Deal. He nodded solemnly, then wrapped both arms around her neck without warning before running toward the dining hall. The hug lasted barely 2 seconds, but the room noticed. Naomi felt it immediately. The staring. The whispers restarting beneath crystal chandeliers. One woman near the piano leaned toward another and murmured something behind her champagne glass. Naomi caught only 2 words clearly. Too attached. She straightened slowly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her uniform. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable now. But Alexander finally spoke from the fireplace, his voice low and thoughtful as he watched his son disappear into the crowd. That boy has not touched anyone willingly in almost a year. Naomi looked at him, uncertain whether the statement was praise or warning. Alexander slipped one hand into his pocket, eyes never leaving the ballroom. Yet somehow, he said quietly, he trusts you. The party finally ended a little after midnight. One by one, black luxury SUVs disappeared down the long curved driveway while rain misted softly over the Hudson River below the estate. Inside the mansion, silence settled slowly into the massive hallways like fog rolling through an empty church. Staff members cleared champagne glasses beneath dimmed chandeliers while distant piano music still drifted faintly from hidden ceiling speakers. Naomi stood alone in the upstairs playroom folding Ethan's sweaters into neat stacks beside the window seat. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, crayons, and the vanilla birthday candles blown out hours ago. She worked quietly, careful not to disturb the strange peace that had settled over the house after the chaos downstairs. Then she noticed it again. The silence. No running footsteps. No shouting. No doors slamming. She glanced toward the digital clock near the bookshelf. 12:43 a.m. Most nights by this hour, Ethan would already be awake again. Crying. Pacing. Refusing sleep while expensive specialists and exhausted nannies tried everything to calm him. At least that was what Mrs. Holloway, the older housekeeper, had told Naomi during her second week working there. The poor child barely sleeps anymore, she had whispered while ironing dress shirts downstairs. Ever since his mother passed, this house has forgotten how to breathe. Naomi understood grief better than most people realized. Sometimes pain did not scream. Sometimes it sat quietly inside a room and changed the temperature of everything around it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Naomi turned to find Alexander Sinclair standing in the doorway without his suit jacket, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. For the first time since she met him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired father. "He is asleep," Naomi said softly before he could ask. Alexander glanced toward the hallway. "Already?" She nodded once. "He wore himself out tonight." Alexander stepped farther into the room slowly, almost cautiously. His eyes moved over the neatly folded clothes, the organized bookshelves, the warm lamp glowing beside the reading chair. Small details no one else in the house seemed to notice anymore. "Every specialist told us structure would help him," he said quietly. "Schedules. Medication. Discipline." Naomi remained silent. Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose. "But somehow the only thing that calms him is you sitting beside him while he falls asleep." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "Sometimes children do not need solutions first," she said gently. "Sometimes they just need to feel safe." The words lingered in the room. Alexander studied her face carefully then, not with suspicion, but curiosity. "Where did you learn that?" Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around one of Ethan's folded sweaters. For a second she almost answered automatically. Almost said nowhere. But something about the quiet exhaustion in his voice made honesty feel easier tonight. "My daughter," she said softly. The room stilled. Even the rain tapping lightly against the windows seemed quieter somehow. Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You have a daughter?" Naomi swallowed once before answering. "I did." No drama. No tears. Just truth spoken gently enough to survive the air between them. Alexander did not interrupt. Naomi appreciated that. Most people rushed to fill painful silences because they feared them. But grief needed room sometimes. "Her name was Ava," Naomi continued quietly. "She used to get scared during storms. Could not sleep unless I stayed beside her bed." She smiled faintly at the memory. "So I stayed." Alexander looked toward the hallway where Ethan slept down the corridor in a room larger than Naomi's entire apartment. "And now you stay for him too." Naomi did not answer right away. Instead she reached for Ethan's small navy cardigan hanging crookedly from the chair and smoothed the sleeve carefully between her fingers. "Children remember who makes them feel alone," she said softly. "But they also remember who did not leave." Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly in the silence. Then came the faint sound of small footsteps moving quickly down the hallway. Seconds later Ethan appeared in the doorway rubbing one sleepy eye, his hair messy from sleep. He looked directly at Naomi first. Always Naomi first. "I had a bad dream," he whispered. And before Alexander could even move, Ethan crossed the room and curled instinctively against Naomi's side like that was the safest place left in the world. The storm arrived just after 2 in the morning. Rain hammered against the tall windows overlooking the Hudson while distant thunder rolled across the dark sky like heavy furniture dragging across hardwood floors. Most of the Sinclair mansion remained silent except for the low hum of air vents and the occasional crackle from the marble fireplace downstairs. Naomi sat beside Ethan's bed beneath the soft glow of a dinosaur-shaped nightlight while the boy slept curled beneath layers of gray blankets. One of his small hands still gripped the sleeve of her sweater even in sleep, like some part of him feared she might disappear if he let go completely. Naomi carefully brushed damp curls away from his forehead and glanced toward the rain streaking down the glass. Storms always carried memories she tried not to revisit too often. Hospitals. Machines. Long nights pretending not to be afraid for someone you loved. She closed her eyes briefly and exhaled slowly. Then Ethan suddenly jerked awake. His breathing came fast and shallow almost instantly. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No, no, no." Naomi leaned forward immediately. "Hey," she said softly. "You are okay." But Ethan was already panicking. His fingers clawed tightly into the blankets while tears filled his eyes faster than he could stop them. "She left again," he gasped. "I could not find her." Naomi recognized that kind of fear. The kind children carried after loss rewired their world into something unsafe. "Look at me, sweetheart." She kept her voice low and steady. "You are here. You are safe." Ethan shook violently now, breaths uneven as thunder rattled the windows again. Down the hallway, footsteps approached quickly. Seconds later Victoria Sinclair appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe, her expression immediately sharpening at the sight before her. "What is happening?" she demanded. Ethan flinched hard at the sudden volume. Naomi noticed instantly. "Please," she said gently without looking away from the boy. "He needs calm right now." Victoria stepped farther into the room, disbelief flashing across her face. "Excuse me?" Another crack of thunder echoed outside. Ethan covered his ears and curled inward against the pillows. Naomi lowered herself carefully onto the edge of the bed beside him. "Ethan," she whispered softly, "can you match my breathing?" She placed one hand lightly over her own chest. "Slow inhale. Slow exhale." Ethan tried to follow, but panic still pulled at him in waves. Victoria crossed her arms tightly. "He needs his medication." Naomi glanced toward the nightstand where the prescription bottle sat untouched beside a glass of water. "Not yet," she said carefully. "He is overwhelmed. If we push too hard right now, it may make the panic worse." The room froze. Victoria stared at her like she had crossed an invisible line no employee should ever approach. "You do not make medical decisions in this house," she said coldly. Naomi swallowed once but stayed calm. "No, ma'am. But I know fear when I see it." Ethan suddenly grabbed Naomi's hand with desperate strength. "Please do not go," he whispered through tears. "Please." Victoria's jaw tightened visibly. "Ethan." But the boy only shook his head harder. Naomi slowly reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of blue fabric worn soft at the edges. A child's handkerchief with tiny stitched stars fading from years of use. "Do you know what this is?" she asked Ethan quietly. He blinked through tears and shook his head. "My daughter used to carry this during storms," Naomi said softly. She called it her brave cloth. Ethan's breathing slowed slightly as he stared at the fabric. Naomi placed it gently into his hands. Whenever she got scared, Naomi continued, she would hold it and count 5 things she could hear. Thunder rolled faintly outside again. Ethan squeezed the cloth tightly. "Rain," he whispered shakily. "Good. Your voice." Naomi smiled faintly. "That is too." Victoria stood frozen near the doorway watching the entire exchange unfold with growing confusion. Because for the first time in nearly a year, her son's panic was not escalating. It was fading. Slowly. Quietly. Humanly. Ethan leaned weakly against Naomi's shoulder, still clutching the blue cloth in trembling fingers. Then in a voice barely louder than the rain outside, he whispered something that made the entire room stop breathing. "Can you stay until I fall asleep again, Mom?" The room went completely still after the word left Ethan's mouth. Even the storm outside seemed to pause between thunderclaps. Naomi felt the little boy trembling against her shoulder while the faded blue cloth remained clutched tightly in his hands. She did not move. Did not correct him. Did not look toward Victoria standing frozen near the doorway. Some moments were too fragile for sudden motion. Ethan's breathing finally slowed into exhausted hiccups as sleep gradually pulled him back under. Naomi gently brushed his curls away from his damp forehead and continued the soft rhythm of her breathing beside him until his small body relaxed completely against the pillows. Only then did she carefully stand from the bed. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath the warm bedroom lighting. "Come with me," she said quietly. Not loud. Not angry. Somehow worse. Naomi followed her downstairs through the massive silent hallways of the Sinclair mansion while rain streaked across the tall windows overlooking the river. The grandfather clock near the library chimed 3 times as they entered Alexander's private study. Dark oak shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Leather chairs sat untouched beside a fireplace burning low with fading embers. Victoria closed the door carefully behind them. "You encouraged this," she said at last. Naomi blinked softly. "Ma'am? Do not insult me by pretending you do not understand." Victoria folded her arms tightly across her chest like she was physically holding herself together. "My son just called you his mother." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "He was frightened. And yet somehow he only reaches for you." The accusation hung heavily in the room. Naomi kept her hands folded calmly in front of her. "I never asked him to." Victoria laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor inside it. Only exhaustion. "You know what people will say if this continues?" Naomi remained silent. "That I lost my own child to the nanny." The sentence cracked slightly near the end despite Victoria trying to keep control of it. Naomi noticed immediately. Beneath the designer silk robe and polished perfection stood a woman terrified of being replaced. Alexander sat quietly near the fireplace the entire time, elbows resting against his knees, watching the exchange unfold without interruption. Finally he spoke. "Victoria." But she shook her head sharply. "No. You saw him tonight. You saw the way he looked at her." Naomi swallowed softly. "Mrs. Sinclair, I would never try to take your place." Victoria's eyes lifted immediately. "You already are." Silence swallowed the room again. The fire crackled faintly behind Alexander while rain tapped softly against the windows. Naomi felt her chest tighten painfully because she understood something Victoria did not. Children did not choose people because of status. They chose safety. "I think," Naomi said gently, choosing every word carefully, "he misses feeling seen." Victoria's expression hardened instantly again. "You think I do not see my own son?" "No, ma'am." Naomi's voice stayed calm. "I think grief has hurt everyone in this house." Alexander looked down at the floor slowly after she said it. But Victoria stared at Naomi like the words physically struck something inside her she had spent months trying not to touch. "You forget yourself," she whispered coldly. Naomi nodded once. "I apologize if I overstepped." Another long silence. Then Victoria walked toward the desk near the windows and picked up a thin white envelope resting beside a silver lamp. She turned back around holding it between 2 fingers. "Your services will no longer be needed after tomorrow morning." Naomi felt the words land quietly inside her chest. Not shock. Just sadness. Upstairs, thunder rolled softly again through the sleeping house. Naomi accepted the envelope carefully with steady hands. 1 week severance pay. More money than she currently had in her checking account. Still, her first thought was not about herself. It was Ethan. Alexander stood slowly from his chair. Victoria, perhaps we should wait until morning. No, her voice came instantly this time. Controlled. Final. The attachment has become unhealthy. Naomi looked toward the rain-covered windows before lowering her eyes again. I understand. She truly did. Rich families often wanted care without connection. Warmth without dependence. Love with professional boundaries. But children did not understand contracts. They only understood who stayed when the nightmares came. Naomi placed the envelope gently against her chest and moved toward the door quietly. Just before she reached it, Alexander spoke again from behind her. Naomi. She paused. His voice lowered slightly. Did Ethan know your daughter's name before tonight? Naomi frowned softly and turned halfway back toward him. No, sir. Alexander looked toward the ceiling above them where his son slept peacefully for the first time in months. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, that is strange. Naomi's heartbeat slowed. Why? Alexander met her eyes fully now. Because earlier tonight, while he was half asleep, he said something before calling for you. Naomi felt cold suddenly despite the warmth of the room. What did he say? Alexander's expression shifted uneasily. He whispered, he said slowly, please do not leave again, Ava. Naomi barely slept the rest of the night. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving silver rainwater clinging to the enormous windows of the Sinclair estate while pale morning light stretched across polished marble floors downstairs. The mansion looked beautiful in the early quiet. Cold too. Like a luxury hotel pretending to be a home. Naomi folded the last of her clothes carefully into a worn brown suitcase beside the small staff bedroom she had occupied for 3 months. 2 sweaters. 1 framed photograph. A pair of sneakers. Her entire life packed neatly beside a bed barely larger than a twin mattress. Outside her door, the house remained unusually silent. No television. No kitchen chatter. No sound of Ethan running through the hallways before breakfast. That silence unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She zipped the suitcase slowly and glanced one final time around the room. Then came a soft knock. Mrs. Holloway stepped inside carrying a tray with untouched coffee and toast. The older woman's gray curls looked hurriedly pinned this morning, worry visible in every line of her face. He will not come out of his room, she whispered immediately. Naomi's chest tightened. Since when? Since he left last night. Mrs. Holloway placed the tray carefully onto the dresser. Mr. Sinclair tried talking to him. Mrs. Sinclair too. Nothing. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. He is hurt. He is devastated. The older woman sighed heavily. That child waited outside your door for nearly an hour. Naomi closed her suitcase quietly so her hands would stop trembling. Downstairs, somewhere far across the mansion, something shattered suddenly. Glass maybe. Then silence again. Mrs. Holloway flinched softly. That would be breakfast, she murmured. Naomi looked toward the hallway instinctively. Every part of her wanted to go upstairs. To sit quietly beside Ethan until the fear passed like she always did. But she no longer belonged here. You should say goodbye, Mrs. Holloway said gently. Naomi swallowed hard. That might make it worse. The older woman studied her face for a long moment. You know, she said quietly, I have worked for wealthy families almost 40 years. She folded her hands together. Most people here know how to provide everything except comfort. Naomi looked down at the faded handle of her suitcase. Love scares people when they cannot control it. Mrs. Holloway's eyes softened sadly. Before either woman could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Alexander Sinclair appeared moments later, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled dress shirt, exhaustion shadowing his face. He looked nothing like the composed billionaire from the ballroom anymore. He locked himself in the bathroom, he said immediately. He will not answer anyone. Naomi's head lifted fast. How long? 20 minutes. Alexander rubbed one trembling hand across his jaw. He keeps saying he wants you. The hallway fell quiet except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Naomi could already picture Ethan curled beside the bathtub, hugging his knees the way frightened children often hid when the world felt too large again. Alexander looked at the suitcase near her bed and something painful crossed his face. I know Victoria asked you to leave. Naomi nodded once. But right now I am not asking as your employer. His voice lowered roughly. I am asking as his father. Naomi hesitated only a second before following him upstairs. The closer they moved toward Ethan's room, the heavier the silence became. Victoria stood outside the bathroom door in a cream cashmere sweater, arms tightly folded, eyes red from either anger or lack of sleep. The moment she saw Naomi approaching, something complicated flickered across her expression. Pride fighting panic. Inside the bathroom, faint. Crying echoed through the door. Naomi moved closer slowly and sat carefully against the hallway wall beside it. She did not knock immediately. She simply stayed there quietly for several seconds. Present. Patient. Then she spoke softly through the door. Hey, sweetheart. The crying stopped instantly. Complete silence. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the white painted wood. It is Naomi. A tiny shaky breath came from the other side. Then Ethan's small broken voice whispered only 4 words. You came back for me. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second after hearing Ethan's voice through the bathroom door. 4 simple words. Soft. Fragile. Yet heavy enough to crack something open inside the hallway. Behind her, Alexander lowered his head slowly while Victoria stood perfectly still near the bedroom entrance, arms folded so tightly across herself it looked painful. Naomi leaned gently against the door. I told you I would not disappear without saying goodbye. Silence answered her at first. Then came the quiet sound of the bathroom lock clicking open. The door moved barely 2 inches before Ethan's small face appeared through the gap, pale and exhausted from crying. His eyes were swollen red beneath messy curls. The brave cloth Naomi gave him during the storm remained clenched tightly in one hand. The moment he saw her still sitting there, his shoulders loosened slightly. Naomi smiled softly. Hey, sweetheart. Ethan opened the door fully then and immediately wrapped himself around her neck. Naomi held him carefully against her chest while the little boy shook silently with leftover fear. Upstairs sunlight filtered weakly through the enormous windows behind them, turning the polished hallway floors pale gold. No one spoke for several seconds. They simply listened to Ethan breathe. Eventually Naomi brushed her hand slowly across his back. You scared everybody. Ethan did not let go. I thought you left. Not yet. He finally pulled back enough to look at her face. Are you going to? The question landed harder than anyone expected. Naomi glanced briefly toward Alexander and Victoria standing nearby before answering carefully. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are complicated. Ethan frowned immediately. That means yes. Naomi opened her mouth softly but stopped herself. Children always heard the truth hiding underneath adult words. Alexander stepped forward at last. Buddy. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Not anger exactly. Hurt. The deeper kind children carried quietly because they did not know where else to place it. "Why are you sending her away?" he asked. Alexander hesitated. Across the hallway, Victoria looked toward the windows instead of the boy. "Because things became confusing," she answered carefully. Ethan's small face tightened. "No, they did not." His voice remained quiet, but every word felt sharp with honesty. "I was sad. Naomi stayed. Everybody else kept leaving." The silence after that sentence felt enormous. Naomi saw Victoria's shoulders shift almost imperceptibly, like something inside her physically recoiled from hearing it spoken aloud. Ethan looked down at the blue cloth in his hand. "After Mom died," he whispered, "people kept trying to fix me." He glanced slowly between his parents. Doctors. Teachers. Nannies. His eyes lifted toward Naomi again. "She just sat with me." Alexander looked away suddenly, jaw tightening hard. Naomi could see it now clearly. The guilt. The realization arriving piece by piece, too late to stop the damage. Ethan moved toward his bedroom quietly and climbed onto the edge of the bed beside the rain-streaked windows. Sunlight touched the side of his face while he stared down at the cloth in his hands. "I did not call her Mom because I forgot Mom," he said softly. Victoria's eyes finally lifted toward him again. Ethan swallowed once. "I called her Mom because that is what safe feels like." Naomi felt her chest ache sharply. Across the room, Victoria blinked hard and turned away toward the hallway before anyone could fully see her expression break. The mansion remained silent except for distant birds outside the windows overlooking the Hudson. Then Alexander noticed something lying partly hidden beneath Ethan's bed. A small black notebook. He picked it up slowly. Ethan stiffened instantly. "Dad." But Alexander had already opened it. The pages inside were filled with uneven handwriting, crayon sketches, and notes from Ethan's therapy sessions over the last year. Most pages carried dark scribbles. Storm clouds. Empty rooms. Tiny figures standing alone. Then Alexander reached the final page. His eyes stopped moving. Naomi watched his expression change completely. Quiet shock first. Then grief. Then something painfully close to shame. "Victoria," he said hoarsely. She turned slowly. Alexander handed her the notebook without speaking. Victoria looked down at the final sentence written shakily in Ethan's small handwriting beneath a drawing of Naomi sitting beside his bed during the storm. "I think Naomi hears the parts of me everyone else is too busy to see." Victoria's lips parted slightly. Her fingers tightened around the notebook. Then Ethan looked directly at her for the first time all morning and asked in the smallest voice imaginable, "Why is loving her making everybody angry?" No one answered Ethan's question right away. The morning light pouring through the windows suddenly felt too bright for the silence sitting inside the room. Victoria stared down at the notebook still trembling slightly in her hands while Alexander remained near the bed, his face shadowed with the kind of regret money could not soften. Ethan looked between them quietly, waiting. Children always waited for adults to explain the pain adults created. Naomi sat carefully beside him on the edge of the mattress, close enough for comfort but careful not to overstep again. She could feel the tension wrapped tightly around the entire house like invisible wire. Finally Victoria spoke, though her voice sounded smaller than before. "It is not wrong to love someone, Ethan." The little boy frowned softly. "Then why does everybody act like it is?" Victoria opened her mouth but no words came immediately. Naomi watched her carefully, then noticed something she had not seen before. Fear. Not pride. Not anger. Fear of losing her place in her son's heart. Alexander slowly crossed the room toward the windows overlooking the river. The clouds had finally begun to break apart outside, thin beams of sunlight touching the water below. "When your mother died," he said quietly without turning around, "we thought giving you everything would protect you. Ethan looked down at the blanket in his lap. But nobody stayed. The sentence landed gently and still somehow shattered the room all over again. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Naomi could almost hear the years of grief pressing against the silence between mother and son. Then Victoria finally walked closer to the bed and knelt slowly in front of Ethan for the first time since Naomi arrived at the estate months ago. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she reached toward him. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "I thought if you loved someone else that much," her voice broke softly, "maybe there would be less room left for me." Ethan stared at her quietly, confusion replacing some of the hurt in his eyes. "That is not how love works." The simplicity of the answer made Alexander lower his head sharply beside the windows. Naomi felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her own eyes. Because children understood things adults complicated with ego and fear. Ethan slowly reached for Victoria's hand. "I do not love Naomi instead of you." His small fingers wrapped carefully around hers. "I love her because she stayed when I was scared." Victoria bowed her head immediately, shoulders trembling once beneath the cream sweater she still wore from the sleepless night. For several seconds nobody moved. Nobody rushed the moment. Naomi simply sat quietly beside Ethan while the enormous mansion around them seemed to breathe differently now. Softer somehow. Real. Alexander finally turned back toward them. His eyes settled on Naomi with complete honesty for the first time since they met. "We failed him," he admitted quietly. Naomi shook her head gently. "You were grieving too." Alexander gave a faint humorless smile. "That is true." But grief became an excuse for absence. The room fell silent again. Then Victoria slowly lifted her eyes toward Naomi. No arrogance left now. No cold distance. Only exhaustion and humility. "I judged you before I ever knew you," she said softly. Naomi did not respond immediately. She remembered the whispers at the party. The warnings. The way people looked through her uniform before seeing her face. But she also saw something else now sitting in front of her. A mother finally confronting her own fear instead of hiding behind status. "You were protecting your son," Naomi answered gently. Victoria shook her head once. "No. I was protecting myself." Ethan suddenly leaned against Naomi's shoulder again, sleepiness returning now that the storm inside him had finally begun settling. His voice came out soft and heavy with exhaustion. "Can Naomi stay?" Alexander and Victoria exchanged a long quiet look. No words. None were needed anymore. Finally Victoria reached over and carefully adjusted the blanket around Ethan's shoulders before answering. "If Naomi wants to." Ethan smiled for the first time all morning. Small. Fragile. Real. Then he looked up at Naomi with sleepy, hopeful eyes. Naomi brushed a hand gently through his curls while sunlight warmed the room around them. "I think," she whispered softly, "I would like that too." 3 weeks later, the Sinclair mansion no longer sounded the same. The silence that once filled every hallway like cold smoke had softened into something warmer now. Some mornings carried the faint smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen. Other mornings carried laughter. Real laughter. The kind that echoed unexpectedly through rooms built more for appearances than living. Autumn sunlight spilled across the enormous windows overlooking the Hudson while orange leaves drifted slowly across the estate grounds below. Naomi stood near the kitchen counter helping Ethan spread strawberry jam across burnt toast while flour dusted the sleeves of his sweater. "That one is definitely inedible," Alexander said from the doorway, loosening his tie with a tired smile after returning early from the office. Ethan grinned proudly anyway. "It is rustic." Naomi laughed softly under her breath while handing Ethan another napkin. Across the room, Mrs. Holloway nearly dropped a serving tray from shock. 3 months ago, this kitchen barely heard conversation above polite whispers. Now the billionaire owner of the house stood eating ruined toast beside his son while sunlight warmed the marble floors beneath their feet. Some changes arrived quietly. Victoria entered moments later carrying fresh flowers from the garden, her cream coat draped neatly over one arm. She paused briefly watching Ethan happily chatter beside Naomi before setting the flowers down near the sink. The hesitation was still there sometimes. The adjustment. But the coldness was gone. "Good morning," she said softly. Naomi looked up with a small smile. "Morning, Mrs. Sinclair." Victoria shook her head gently after a second. "Victoria is fine." Ethan immediately pointed his butter knife toward Naomi. "See? I told you." Naomi smiled despite herself. Outside the windows, the river reflected pale gold beneath the morning sun while somewhere upstairs music played softly from Ethan's room. Children healed strangely. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just little pieces returning over time. Sleeping through the night. Eating breakfast downstairs again. Leaving bedroom doors open. Alexander moved toward the coffee machine while Ethan tugged lightly on Naomi's sleeve. "Can we still do movie night tonight?" Naomi raised an eyebrow playfully. "Only if somebody finishes math homework first." Ethan groaned loudly. "You sound exactly like a mom." The kitchen went quiet for half a second. Not painful this time. Just still. Naomi glanced instinctively toward Victoria. But instead of tension, she found something else in the woman's expression now. Acceptance. Maybe even gratitude. Victoria walked slowly toward Ethan and brushed a hand gently through his curls. "You know," she said softly, "love does not run out just because more people share it." Ethan looked up at her carefully. "Really?" Victoria nodded once. "Really?" Then she surprised everyone by turning toward Naomi fully. "Thank you," she said quietly. Naomi blinked slightly. "For what?" Victoria's eyes drifted toward her son standing between them. "For staying." The room fell softly silent again. Warm this time. Human. Naomi looked down at Ethan's small hand still gripping her sleeve the same way it had during the storm weeks earlier. Only now the fear was gone from his eyes. Replaced with trust. Outside, wind rustled through orange trees lining the estate, while sunlight painted golden reflections across the kitchen floor. Ethan suddenly yawned dramatically and leaned sleepily against Naomi's side. Alexander laughed quietly into his coffee cup. "That kid acts like surviving 4th grade is a full-time job." "It is," Ethan mumbled against Naomi's sweater. Mrs. Holloway smiled from the doorway while pretending to rearrange dishes she had already organized twice. Naomi looked around the kitchen slowly then. At the tired father finally learning how to be present. At the mother brave enough to soften. At the little boy no longer carrying grief alone. She realized something quietly in that moment. Sometimes families were not rebuilt through grand speeches or miracles. Sometimes they healed through ordinary mornings. Through staying. Through listening. Through one frightened child discovering that love did not disappear every time the storm came back. Ethan's eyes drifted closed for a second against Naomi's shoulder while sunlight wrapped gently around the kitchen like warmth returning after a long winter. And for the first time since entering the Sinclair mansion, Naomi no longer felt like someone standing outside the glass looking in. She felt like home.